Right, welcome everyone to the Cartographer office hours meeting, weekly office hours meeting. Today is February 22nd, and we're glad that you're here. All right, for today's session, could we have a note taker, please? Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Zero. Not voluntary to be a note taker or no? Okay, I can try. That we will add myself. No problem. Just feel free to add your name to the attendees list. This thing here. All right. I see several discussion topics, especially the first lines were put there by Oshuma. So if you were not able to see this before the meeting, I will give you 30 minutes starting now to be able to read topics, and then we will be able to discuss. 30 seconds, sorry. All right, time's up. Welcome, Scott Rosenberg. Welcome again. We're glad to have you here. Okay, first section, thoughts on why multipath is a strong choice for Cartoon. So let's get this going. I will put there the PR maybe. Let me find it. Okay, it's there. All right, any comments around multipath?
I think this is Washuma's, right? And we're missing him
Yeah.
here.
I think he wrote these comments because he knew he wasn't going to be here.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, so maybe we could just go over them and then see if we agree or disagree with some of his comments, right? And then, because we do need to make a decision, right, between multipath and type supply chains because we need to move forward. So what's he saying? Some of these thoughts on why multipath is a strong choice. So first point being implementation should be fairly simple. I think so, like, I guess low cost to implement, I guess is one argument for multipath. I don't know.
I don't think there's much disagreement on that.
I think his second point is a little more, is a little bigger, right? That like if you have a supply chain that ends with different outputs, right? Like the inner outer loop situation where you either need a, or the like get ops versus like image ops thing where you either need to push get ops from a source or you need to push an image from an image, right? It's like you need to take the input from two different places. With snippets, your entire first, everything before that in your supply chain essentially needs to be encapsulated in one big mini supply chain or intermediate supply chain.
Yeah, it is. It does get kind of wonky. I kind of scoped this out when I put together a gist. That one, David, do you mind pulling that one up? So I think what this point illustrates is that if at the very end of your supply chain, you have two diverging options, right? In this case, you have a GitOps and a RegOps supply chain. The supply chains themselves don't end up containing all that much useful information because they basically both share this configure step, which contains the bulk of your logic. And then they each have a separate second step, where in the first case, like on line 17, GitOps, and on line 17, the second one, RegOps. So most of your logic is encapsulated away somewhere else.
I wonder thinking about encapsulation of the supply chains like this. The second point is about, if you do this encapsulation, you still only kind of get one supply chain at any level, right? Your output is always, kind of well defined from the perspective of a single supply chain, right? And that's a like disadvantage, or it's less flexible compared to multipath, where in multipath you can overlay any number of supply chains on top of the same supply chain, right? A supply chain can be 20 different supply chains, and it just depends on the conditionals at the higher ones and how they drive different inputs at the lower ones, and you lose some context there, right? You can no longer look at a supply chain and kind of know what's going to happen. But you do have that extra flexibility, and it is more concise to express, this supply chain can have different outputs. I wonder how important is it to be able to have supply chains that have different outputs that are well-defined outputs, where you can look at a workload and understand what the final artifact is, versus having multiple supply chains for different artifact outputs. How critical is that functionality? Curious if Scott and James especially, I know you're kind of new to this, I'm not sure if you've seen this kind of specific thing about the outputs before.
I think from my point of view, I've always found it a lot easier to grok any of this is by go through these examples that you've got showing up there, Josh. I think that's really helpful. I think where I was coming from, it was mainly around the UX of this. So I think we know that things can be a little bit complex. There's a little bit of an on-ramp on the moment. And right now our interface for the supply chains is via YAML. And it does feel like we can come up with some elegant solutions, but it's hard at the moment for people to understand what's going on when with their supply chain, to maintain and manage their supply chains. There's lots of indirection. So I think it's one of these things that I don't have a strong enough opinion for anything. I know that a lot of people have invested a lot of time in this, but I just want to try and emphasize the need for a good UX around this, so that people can understand what they're doing and how to maintain them going forward.
And I personally, go ahead, sorry. No, I am a big fan of the multipath, I think, over the snippets, just because I think the flexibility makes it a lot easier. I have had, again, if we use snippets, there will be a lot of cases with many supply chains that could be solved in a single supply chain. And I think that it doesn't prevent you, if someone wants to create supply chains that are easier to understand, they still can do it with multipath. They don't need to use multipath. Multipath is just an escape hatch that makes it easier to, if you wanted to make that complex supply chain that's possibly very difficult to understand exactly what's happening, you have that capability that snippets doesn't give you. So I think that, you know, for the advanced use case, I think that's big from my perspective.
Snippets still allows you to take multiple paths, right? Like as long as you define those paths as different optional snippets, you have the same power, right, in the end, except for, you know, there's some edge cases like at the point where we start needing to define, we don't have this yet, but if we need to define supply chain outputs, right? Like say we're going to create a source supply chain, cluster source supply chain, cluster image supply chain, then snippets can be a little, you know, if we use that implementation to implement snippets, you know, then you can't, you know, have a multipath version that has truly different outputs instead, right? So they're, you know, but aside from kind of the boundaries of that, one doesn't seem more or less powerful to me. It just seems like they're different user experiences for how you configure kind of the same outcome.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think overall, the single YAML is where I come back to with the big reason why I'm a big supporter of this, just because understanding one complex YAML is easier for me than jumping between 30 YAMLs. Just from a personal level.
And you think an inline version of that would be too much nesting? I think we tried that and it was pretty nesty.
Yeah, it became very nesty. And I think that I think that multipath was kind of the easiest way for me to understand it. And I think that it is really easy when you have one or two conditionals or three conditionals, you know, within a supply chain. It still is pretty easy to understand, you know, where things are going to. When it gets more complex and you have, you know, 7 options for a specific thing or whatever, yeah, it becomes complex there. But that's where, you know, graphs like, you know, Rashid was building for, you know, where you could get a UI kind of come out from the supply chain, or something like a dry run that would tell you what the path would be taken from a workload. I think that makes it easier. And you still gain the benefits of it being in a single YAML instead of more levels of nesting.
I think I worry about, you know, what it would be like to design a UI to build a supply chain. If, you know, like to be able to cover that, you have a conditional input further up the graph that then drives other inputs that, based on which input is driven, makes decisions further down in the graph, and that can nest, right? And that, so you can end up like a supply chain builder would have to cover the full functionality, right? It would have to let you build in a UI with graphical interface, right? Many overlaid things. And that seems like it'd be hard to kind of get right. You know what I mean?
Wouldn't the exact same issue happen though with snippets? Because in snippets, you can still have multiple options. It wouldn't be any different, except for the fact that you could just blob things together and say, hey, this is, you know, we're doing stuff here. This is a, you know, closed whatever. It's just showing less information, right? If you wanted to show all the information in both cases, you have the same amount of paths.
I think with snippets, you can use encapsulation to present the same interface over and over again. You could, like, you know, because you only get one conditional at each box, right? You could say this box isn't a, you know, KPAC image template that, or, you know, whatever integration, it's another supply chain. And you double click on that, you get the same editor and you get to do the same thing, right? And to me, that interface seems a little, it's like less to understand, or like, you know, less the encapsulation there. I don't know.
We have a Miro board for this so that we can talk with visuals. I'm trying to find it right now. It'll help.
Did that kind of make sense though, Scott?
Yeah, I think it does, except the question is, when you move to snippets in the end, someone that wants to understand how things are working the whole way, how would you would still need to show all of the options, right? Like, you could encapsulate, you could have a kind of minimized view of just what the overall steps are, but you would still have the necessity of having some way of showing the entire graph for someone to be able to visualize it and all the options.
Sorry, the entire graph of a supply chain or the entire graph of a workload? I'm curious which one when you're thinking about visualizing every step. So like,
I don't think that understanding a supply chain matters out of the context of a workload in a UI. I think that from a UI's perspective, the most important is give me a demo workload, give me an example workload YAML, and I'll show you what it would produce from this supply chain.
So I was thinking about this in the context of building a supply chain, like as an operator for many workloads. But that's what I'm thinking about, drag and dropping, and designing an interface for multipath versus designing an interface for snippets. Are you thinking more about like just visualizing something in the context of one workload? Or can you help me understand?
Yeah, and I'm thinking of it I'm trying to understand what would happen with a workload. What is actually going to happen if I create a workload this way? What's going to happen if I create a workload a different way? What would actually happen here? Kind of like a dry run UI that would show you what would happen with a supply chain.
So in both cases, though, you can fully resolve the graph if you're at once you have a workload, right, and you have that static configuration, you can fully resolve the graph into the same concrete steps. And so the visualization of a workload doesn't have to be different in the supply chain case, or in the snippets case versus the multipath case, right? Because we're only talking about static configuration.
Exactly. No, I don't think it needs to change there. What I was saying is I don't think that you get any more simplicity in the UI necessarily by using snippets, though, because if that's the use case, the one that I was talking about, we were just talking about different UI use cases. I think in the UI use case of this, it's in the end you want to show the whole graph, so the whole graph is the same graph in either path.
Yeah,
the UI for editing a supply chain is going to be different than the UI for viewing what's happening for a specific workload.
Yeah.
So I'm mostly concerned with, like, if you're going to build a UI for an operator to be able to create a supply chain, I think multipath, where you have a condition far up the graph and you have to graphically represent a builder interface, right, where that can cascade into multiple inputs, where the inputs drive subsequent steps. It creates like many simultaneous graphs that you have to think about managing at the same time. And kind of the same, I have the same feeling about the YAML. Like, if it's simple, it's probably better than snippets. But as soon as it becomes, more complex, you have more integrations, you have different people maintaining different parts of it. Isn't that multipath seems like it could get very, kind of,
yeah.
You might feel like you need to refactor. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
Both is definitely an option in the long run, right? Like, they're both just tools for achieving different things. To me, it's more like what in the short term, what's the first step?
So on that note, no, it's good. So on that note, I mean, it's just hard, just so I can kind of gauge an understanding, because it's a little bit difficult. I know it's not very particularly scientific, so I know people aren't on this call, but what camp are we in at the moment? Are we on the snippets camp? Are we on the multipath camp? What are people thinking? Do we have a raise of a hand who are kind of leaning towards snippets at the moment? Okay, so we've got a 1. And I can't see you, Scott, by the way, so you might have to say something.
I am a multipath person personally.
Okay, so we got and anybody with a multipath? Yeah, okay, so Cyril and Marty. And so that's kind of where we can. But then come back to the previous point. Is that a fair statement that we're probably going to need to do both? Yeah.
I would say we should do one, and then we should get feedback about it, and then make the decision for whether we're going to do the other. But I wouldn't exclude doing both, right? Or like, who knows what, like, after you do one thing, people use it all sorts of ways, and maybe there's a better option than both of these we're not thinking about that we'll figure out, right?
Yes, Scott, go on.
I mean, just to echo that, like, I definitely don't think these are either or. Like, they're different approaches that could potentially be used to solve the same problem, but they're also distinct. Like if we're trying to make a decision right now, it's a little bit tough because just the RFCs are different levels of maturity. Like I think there are unresolved issues in the multipath PR, especially just regarding syntax and like what, like how you know as a user exactly how things propagate and which components will still get stamped out when different branches are taken, and how you transition between those branches. So I think there's still questions there that need to be sorted. The thing I like most about the snippets is the encapsulation. So like independent of like using it to select different paths through a supply chain, like snippets are useful. Like right now we basically have like the example supply chain that basically goes from source code to a running URL. But if you have a different type of workload runtime where you want to say, okay, I want to bottom out on Knative versus a Kubernetes deployment versus a Kubernetes job versus a Tecton task, or like whatever else you want to run out on. Like the first several steps, like resolving source code, building, testing, are all going to be relatively the same. And then the part that's going to vary is going to be on the end, depending on like what exact runtime resource you're stamping out for the workload. So like all those commonalities can be like encapsulated within a single snippet and then shared across multiple. So then you can also upgrade those things together. So like in terms of deciding which one is better at the moment, I don't think the proposals are on equal footing. In terms of like the ability to like start progress on one, I think snippets is more mature in terms of an RFC. That still might be true that the multipath thing is going to be easier to implement. So like it, I don't know how that washes out.
The way I've been thinking about it is, I do think the simple case for multipath is simpler than anything related to snippets. And so to me, it made the most sense to do the simple thing, to solve the simple cases. And then once we see that those simple cases are getting too complex, that's when it makes sense to, you know, think about extracting other CRDs into these reusable components for snippets. But it's really about like waiting till we see how that complexity shakes out and then solving that problem.
It feels like we're not in agreement on what the problem we're trying to solve is. Almost like if we're saying we can't compare these RFCs because they're not mutually exclusive and don't necessarily like can both solve the same problem, but also both have like different other elements to them. Like what's the exact problem we're trying to solve, and like which one do we think solves that specific problem better, you know?
I don't know if we're not aligned on which problem we want to solve, just whether it's better to start with a, you know, it's like over what time period are we optimized solving a problem, right? Like I think multipath in the short term is a very elegant solution for, you know, letting you know, take the supply chains we already have, create multiple paths through them, as long as it's simple, right? As long as you don't build too much complexity into that, as long as we don't have a UI yet, we're going to build against it, right? It's, you know, it is very elegant. Like I you know, I have to imagine, like Scott's right, you have to imagine some of the logic for the branching, you know, further down. But, you know, to me, it seems very elegant. But I worry about the long-term implication. I worry about, you know, giving people, especially if it's the only tool to do branching, once your supply chains start getting more complex, you know, like it's, and once we need to build UI around it, right? It's going to get like, you know, in the long term, it may create more trouble for us, if that makes sense, more trouble for users. Whereas snippet seems like maybe it's a little bit less functional in some ways. You know, maybe it's not as nice a UX for making simple branches through, right? But it seems very, like, we'll need it eventually. It seems very sustainable, right? And so that's why I kind of lean towards the safer option first, if that makes sense, because I'm thinking more about the long-term outcome.
Are you thinking there's fewer unknowns around the snippets approach? Right. Okay, yeah. Ciro, just sorry to pick on you, but we'd love to know your thoughts.
Yeah, sure. So for me, what's interesting about snippets is like it becomes very easy to figure out like, oh, at the end of the day, what's the supply chain about, right? Like regardless of how many things it does, it's like, oh, somehow get some configuration, push it somewhere, right? Like when you're just looking at those like maybe 2 resources that you're seeing from like the main cluster supply chain. And then sure, there might be a lot of branching going on underneath those like 2 top level resources. And like, yeah, the fact that you can abstract it in that way, like love it about snippets, like this idea of like, oh, it's as if you could like create partials, right? And then now your templating becomes much simpler, thinking about like, I don't know, each HTML even, right? Like this idea of, oh, create these partials, then you create this web page and you can reason about it, as opposed to if you were to do everything inline. So love that. But if the only approach to doing branching is nesting via this interaction, yeah, then it also gets really complicated. That's why for me, like both makes a lot of sense because of the elegance of doing branching via multipath and the ability to do this logical grouping of complicated things through snippets. I really like both. From the team, the perspective that I get is that multipath is actually easier to reason about the edge cases right now, so we would end up with a solution that has actually less problem, like there are less unknowns, like unknown unknowns from an implementation perspective, and the team could iterate much quicker than snippets. So if I were to vote, vote was the only one. I'd go with what the team is posting forward, which is, yeah, start with multipath and then go for snippets, even though personally, I also really like snippets. And the version of snippets that I really like is the one where we reuse the templates we have, like cluster source template, so on and so on, and then make use of like an extra few resources. And then, yeah, you either use resources or a template in those objects. All right, I condensed a lot of stuff. Does that help?
That was really good. That was really good. I do wonder. It probably can't be answered now, but like that was a really good view there, Cyril. And I just wonder, is that something? Do you think, presenting that from the snippets point of view, do you think more people might come on board with that approach, or do you think that is, I mean, maybe Marty can help answer this. Do you think Cyril's view there could help nudge along the snippets approach to start with, or do you think, or maybe that's a question for Josh or Marty, whoever, did that add more colour for the snippets, or is it still multipath?
So to me, that asks a different question, because what Cyril pointed out, right, is that snippets also has a whole bunch of proposed syntaxes at the moment, and he identified one that I didn't think was the front runner, because right now there's a few different proposals for snippets. One is allowing a whole bunch of resources to be nested under a template, and the other is allowing typed supply chains. And so it's interesting, right? Because it's not just the conversation between multipath and snippets at this point. It's a question of multipath or version A, B, or C, or D, or E of snippets. So yeah. And I think that snippets as a whole has a whole bunch of like open-ended questions around it that we haven't resolved as well, and that all of the different options, they all have the same inherent problems.
Okay, I mean, thanks. That's really good. I think to Scott's point in the chat, we've not got long. We've been quite on this. I wonder just if we can. Personally, I found it a little bit difficult with 2 RFCs and try and keep track of 2 different places. There's lots of overlap. I wonder if we can kind of continue this discussion, whether there's a better way we can continue this discussion, find out what we need, what information, either analysis we need to do, or any more unknowns we can find, and we'll see if we can act on this. Follow up, maybe with someone we can chat on, find an approach to do this more asynchronously on Slack, potentially, if people are up for that.
Kubernetes Slack.
Yeah. Maybe David, you could help
posted-
facilitate something. Sorry, go on, Josh.
In the Kubernetes Slack, I posted both the options and all of the gists that all solve the exact same use case. So far, there hasn't been many responses. Scott, who actually just dropped off, we had a good discussion there. But hopefully, yeah, if there's other things that people want to add, please add it to the Slack thread that I opened over there.
Cheers.
All right. Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, right. It's already also there in the note, Slack thread. Okay, yeah, time to move to the next items we have in the agenda, only 30 minutes. Okay, proposing final comment period for several RFCs. Yeah, I was checking the RFC, the new RFC process. The final comment period will trigger a 7-day period to provide comments, and also a disposition of the outcome, merge, close, postpone, etc. So I believe, I don't know who put these proposals here.
Sorry, all of those were me.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, we have some hopefully less contentious RFCs that we have some approvals on already. So yeah, I just want to propose that we move to close all these. This first one is the new workload status that Scott proposed.
This is resource tracing, not artifact tracing, right?
Correct.
Awesome. Yeah. And we just need do we have the number of votes we need from the maintainer team?
I guess just logistically, this is the first working call where this has been available as an RFC. So it might be worth just running through it really quickly.
We talked about your comment in the previous RFC last week. So we did introduce like the general idea,
okay.
but I definitely would love to give you an opportunity to talk through some of your thoughts around it.
Yeah, the TLDR is this is a distilled subset of what was proposed in RFC 18 and I think also RFC 14, where essentially the goal here was just to take information that Cartographer already has when it's processing a supply chain and reflect that out onto the workload status, as well as the deliverable status. Anything workload is equally applicable to delivery. So there are no changes to the actual semantics of processing any resources. There's nothing in terms of making sure that one input becomes one output, or knowing what the inputs were to a specific output, or whether a resource is healthy, or any of that. Like all that can be defined later and downstream. So I guess kind of what's here is basically just a list of resources that are all named and then have a reference to the actual template. In this case, it's almost always going to be a cluster something template resource, as well as the stamped resource. So it's the resource that the template is actually templating. And then also including the inputs and outputs as far as we know them. So the input is really just the name there is a reference to the resource that is being inputted. So it's basically just when the template defines that there's a source or an image or a config to pull in from another resource. The output's something that I changed a little bit earlier today based off of feedback from Evan on RFC 18, as well as just a general concern they had. So it is basically a named copy of the output. So basically, like for an image, it's going to be image. For source, it's going to be URL. Revision for config, it's config. And an earlier version of this RFC basically had the value captured. Ended up backing that off for both concerns around like, are these values safe to actually expose directly on the workload, just in case for some reason like RBAC is set up and you don't want to expose the internal implementation details to a user. But secondarily, and actually probably primarily, the if you have a large supply chain that's producing large artifacts, the size of those could accumulate to be bigger than the size of a Kubernetes resource that would be allowed. So you could end up just denial servicing that workload just because there's too much data within it. So instead, backed it off to be a digest, which is basically a SHA-256 of the actual real value, and then also capturing the JSON path on the actual stamped resource, where a user could look up the stamped resource and resolve that value themselves. And the last bit there is just having a timestamp for the last time that the value changed.
On the values thing, this makes it so that if you were to visualize the resources and the current inputs and outputs to the resources, you have to traverse through more than just the workload. If I'm thinking about how would I visualize that, it wouldn't be dump a whole bunch of data for the really large values. Would it make sense to introduce some kind of value summary or SHA of the config for configs, or some way to represent the artifact, the actual artifact that's not the literal value?
Yeah, so that's what the digest there is basically defined as the SHA-256 of the actual value.
Okay, and then on inputs, is there a reason we're not doing the same thing?
It's duplicative. Like now that we're not including the full values, we probably could and get away with it. But effectively, because an input is just a reference to a previous output,
okay.
If you know the name of the resource, you can look it up pretty easily.
Is there a reason to use the digest for source and image types, given that they're constrained to already being digests, essentially, or close to digests?
Yeah, this was a comment thread. It's just, it's not a matter of right and wrong. It's just a matter of choice. I was optimizing for making something easier for a user to potentially consume. So basically having named resources, I thought would be easier for a user rather than them needing to say, okay, is this a config type? Then if it's a config type, I do X versus Y. I realize that logic has to exist somewhere. It's just a matter of how and where it exists. So we could totally go and make it more concrete types.
I think I'm just thinking additive to what you have. Like, could you do a summary of the real value for source and image, and maybe not for config or something, so that when you look at the workload, you actually understand, like, because right now it would be great if you could just look at the YAML and see this is where this commit is, right? Instead of
it's a little bit cheating because it's like these values we accept to be smaller, and config is like the who knows what it is. Like it could literally be anything. Like, yeah, we could still have the value in place for those ones because they should be shorter. But at the same time, I thought it was just worth being consistent and just kind of treating the object model like there's one way. If you want the value, then this is what you do every single time.
I think I can think of a few ways to achieve that consistency. It's like you could say that the digest value for those types is just the digest, but the digest value for configs is the SHA of the config, and then you'd at least have one field, right? Or you could say like everything has a digest. You could say everything has a digest and there's a value summary, and the value summary for the source is like a condensed version because it can be multi-field, right? And the value summary for the image digest is just this one image digest string with maybe
like if we wanted to incrementally add back specific values, I think we can definitely do that. At this point, probably a separate RFC, where if we want to say like add explicit values for source templates, add explicit values for image templates, then I think we can sort of address those separately. Like, I'm not opposed to that. It's just a matter of, I was just trying to do like one thing consistently that will work across the board for this RFC.
I agree about it's better to have consistency. I just wonder if we can have that consistency and have the ability to say like, there's the commit is where I think it is, right? Without having to cross-reference.
Yeah, I just worry that if we have some values and then some digest, then users will get confused about like, oh, well, why do I have to do all this extra work in this one case? Well, if you're building a UI, you know how to do that work. So like, it shouldn't matter. But I agree with someone just looking at the status, it's going to be a little bit more opaque.
Got it.
Right, great, thank you. So yeah, for the proposal is to trigger a final comment period. At least as per the process, there should be a voting before we can enter this stage, and the FCP will last 7 days, or if there is agreement, it can close early. So we should do the voting right now to enter this RFC into FCP stage.
I think the voting should be asynchronous on GitHub based on the,
Asynchronous, yeah,
or
that's better.
if you want to vote for it, do the review the PR and say approve.
Sure.
Are we voting on the RFC or whether to enter into the final comment period?
It's the same thing because final comment period, when it like when you enter it into final comment period, you say with the decision, like after 7 days, it will be approved unless someone raises a big issue. So we would have to vote like, yes, approve in 7 days from now. And then by default in 7 days, it'll just be approved.
It's a waiting period in case there's significant dissent. If there's like, if we're not all unanimous on something, we're not going to move ahead with it immediately. There's just some amount of time before we, will accept that there is dissent and we're going to move forward anyways.
Right. Got it. Okay, next one, more options selectors.
This just adds the match labels to a template selector. So yeah, that part right there.
Do we have enough votes on any of these to move them into final comment period? Or are we gonna hit the same problem?
They all have approvals, right? That's why I'm trying to move along, is they all have some approvals, and just want to make more approvals happen faster. So I think if our RFC has some approvals, right, I think it's good to try and move it into the final review period to, make sure that we can all agree before this thing drags on too long. So like, is anyone opposed to match labels?
So everyone else submit your votes.
Sorry, by match labels, do you mean match fields? Or did I?
No, match labels, which would sit alongside match fields as like a convenience.
This is in options, right?
This is in options.
Yeah, in options, adding a match label so that they're consistently more.
And the problem here is that it's a breaking change.
Not here.
It's a new feature.
That's a different one. Okay.
That's the different one.
Additive.
So vote on that one, everybody. Next one is this one.
This adds match fields and match labels to the top level of blueprints.
This is the break.
And this is the breaking change, because right now match labels is nested directly under the selector field.
I mean, right now match labels doesn't exist and the label itself is nested directly under. Yeah.
Yeah, the contents of match labels is nested directly into the selector. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm definitely thumbs down on doing this in V1 Alpha 1. But then after that.
Sorry, V1 Alpha 1.
That's the version of
The
our
resource version.
API.
So you want to, oh, so are you okay if we bump to V1 Alpha 2?
If you think this is worth that, sure. I should actually, before I say sure, I will go through and reread everything. But like, if this is expected to go into V1 Alpha 1, that's a thumbs down from me.
I mean, no, the proposal is we do the migration, right? And to do them, like part of the migration would be a conversion webhook and bumping versions.
Are you
Just
prepared?
the example still says V1 Alpha 1. And yeah, creating conversions is annoying the first time around.
Are you prepared to keep the old version supported for potentially an extended period of time?
Could we do the bad option and have both of them? Like you could specify the label top level or under match labels?
Not if both keys are called selector.
Yeah. Well, no, if both keys was, if you wanted a match on a key called matchLabels and matchFields, I mean, that would be the only collision you'd have there. You'd have two reserved words under selector for label types that couldn't be used as labels.
It would work in in nearly all practical cases, but it would also be really, really gross.
Okay.
That's my take.
I don't disagree. I think controlling the version is fine too. I don't see why we couldn't support both. I mean, most of our CRDs are referential, right? So, and if they're not referential enough, we make them so that the only difference is what the selector object looks like on the two different versions. We just have a bit to deal with. It doesn't mean we have to do the work today, but that's the right way to proceed.
But are we going to bump everything to V1 Alpha 2 because of this one change?
Mm-hmm.
I meant
One
more like, do we
question.
want to? But yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering, like, once we get snippets or multipath, like, for the supply chains we're writing right now, we don't really need this, right? Like, I'm wondering if this is one of those that, like, we should just wait until there's more, like, users demanding it. And
if we want to deliver a good solution for using pre-built images as a source to a supply chain and implement that with the snippets approach, then we need to be able to select at the top level based off of fields. We need the top level field selector on supply chain if we want to do snippets.
There may be other breaking changes we would not want to introduce for snippets that would suggest a V1 Alpha 1. And so we could roll this change into snippets should snippets be the implementation. I don't know if it's worth approving this RFC with a caveat that says this will go into the next, next version when we release it, which may include waiting for other breaking changes to occur at the same time. Sorry, Rash.
Yeah, my question is, how else do you do it? It seems to me like the right way here is to start V1 Alpha 2, put the first breaking change in there that's going to exist so that we're better prepared for other breaking changes. But how do you release that and say, we're releasing with a stable API of V1 Alpha 1, a V1 Alpha 2 is unstable? If we can do that, then getting it in as early as we have time to do it seems healthier than, well, when we've got a collection of things that are going to be breaking changes, we'll then cut V1 Alpha 2, and that's now stable. You know what I mean? If that makes sense.
You can.
So one of the, go ahead, Stephen.
I mean, I think Scott may have more opinions about versioning in the Caves ecosystem in this way than I do, but I think nothing stops you from creating that V1 Alpha 2 version and adding this feature to it and telling, not publishing it as part of your public API, right, in code, right? Like nothing stops you from that approach of maintaining another line that you're not, making available to users that you're going to provide any kind of support guarantee to, and changing that over time. What I would avoid is releasing one breaking change in V1 Alpha 2 and then saying everybody migrate to V1 Alpha 2 when you have another breaking change that you need to make in V1 Alpha 3, and then forcing people to continue to migrate versions forward. But
no, I think you're right. Yeah, I mean, that
Yeah.
feels great to me because I think because my personal obsession with this one here is that it's consistent. It's a nicer interface, not who wants to use it and who's going to need it. I think if we have a solution for multipath at V1A1, V1 Alpha 1, we're good to go, but it would still be nice to have something consistent. So we should start that work now, or as soon as we can with something that says that's acceptable.
So two things in terms of just version that's worth calling out. One is that the key difference between like creating a new Kubernetes version of a resource of the API versus like your traditional semver, like we made a breaking change, bump the major, is that each of these V1 Alpha 1, V1 Alpha 2, V1 Alpha 3, so on and so forth, need to be maintained in the future. And beyond that, it's not just that they all need to be maintained into the future until you're actually ready to remove support for a specific version, but you also need to be able to upgrade and downgrade these resource versions to whatever downgrade means, so that you can't lose state as you round trip between the different versions. And if you define a resource as V1 Beta 1, someone loads it as V1 Alpha 1, there's a subset of their capabilities, they edit that subset of the capabilities, and then it needs to get promoted back into V1 Beta 1 the way the user would have expected it to happen, for whatever that means semantically. So like, you can say like, oh yes, this is forward upgradable, but how you take this version that's proposed, even if it is just as V1 Alpha 2, and then expose it as V1 Alpha 1 in a way that a user can still edit the label selector and have it like work meaningfully, could be a little bit complicated.
And to make that really concrete, like in this case, it means that that extra field you want to add has to show up in V1 Alpha 1 somewhere, right? It can't just be a V1 Alpha 2 extra field.
So we would need a field selector entry is what we're suggesting there, right? In V1 Alpha 1. I don't know, it seems like work to learn how to do to be able to introduce these sorts of things. Is there another driving force on this one other than consistency, assuming everything else is equal, we come up with a multipath solution?
Snippets, right? Was one of the driving forces I heard.
Oh, snippets drives the need for this? Oh, okay, I see.
Honestly, to me, this is
that true at the supply chain level? I definitely understand that the snippet would have a field selector associated with it, most likely.
Snippets necessitates multiple supply chains. And so it necessitates a field selector on those supply chains. Honestly, this is the most important thing I think we should drive forward right now, just because even if we don't do snippets or multipath, if we have top level field selectors like this, then you could even just achieve pre-built images using multiple supply chains, even if you had to duplicate a whole bunch of things.
So
I mean, you could do it with labels, but it's nicer with fields.
This only necessitate, or snippets only necessitate top level field selectors for configurations where you need multiple top level supply chains, right? Not for configurations where you need multiple inner supply chains. And we only need multiple top level supply chains for supply chains that have different outputs. Is that right? And so
sorry, you're right. Yeah.
There's a lot of ifs over whether we need this, or like this is really about one particular implementation of snippets, not necessarily any implementation of snippets.
I think in every implementation of snippets, we would need multiple supply chains because of that last output in the supply chain. Because right now, as it's defined, options in a supply chain can't take a template type. That template type needs to exist outside of the option. So we have no way of branching in a supply chain using different types. So any supply chain that has different types, any usage of different types necessitates a different supply chain in every solution except for multipath.
No, didn't we already solve that with is it RFC 9 or is it another?
Wouldn't they both end
like,
off in a cluster template like Scott? Yeah, like
yeah, like each template has to, each resource has to match exactly one template, but you can still have optionality in there, and that could use a field selector.
That
Yeah,
can
I
use a
think it
field
should work.
selector, but they have to both use the same type.
but wouldn't they both be a cluster template?
They
Input.
could both be a cluster template, but then you lose the final output of the supply chain, which is important.
I mean, which is not a concept. It is to some extent, it's a different feature than multipathing, and that that is something that we haven't implemented yet. That is not a direct use case that we're talking about when we talk about either the snippets or the multipath implementation. Sorry, Rash.
As I understood it, it was not that the cluster template was a force type. It was that it's the last step has to take an input of one type. And weren't we going to be able to support inputs of two different types? That's what needed to happen at the last step. I'm just checking because that's what I thought. I'm going to find my graph, I guess.
Outputs of two different types?
Yeah, two different type of outputs, like
the thing that pushes, you're saying needs to either take an image or a source.
Yeah, it needs to take an image or a source. And we can do that with YTT, but if we're trying to avoid using YTT for that sort of selection, the problem we have is that we want a template that will select on the source or select on the image.
They both take a config.
Okay.
Right? But they output a source or an image depending on which path you take. And based on Scott's resources RFC, if we want that to show up meaningfully in the workload status, right, then they need to be properly typed.
All right. Now it makes sense. Now you mentioned the resource RFC. I didn't see why the problem was.
It's all connected.
Yeah, I didn't understand what you're
It's
talking
like a
about.
directed
Outputs until you
acyclic
said
graph.
that.
We need to do a dependency graph of all the RFCs now. Scott didn't think I was joking.
Yeah, it's like, how do you weigh one small meaningful change that people can independently reason about versus, you know, the fact that they're all actually connected and build off one another.
Okay, so sorry, the final two items on the agenda, the match param selector and amendment to RFC 9. Are they related somehow?
Yeah, the next I get it's more just trying to move these two along as well. This one's about adding a match params selector. I took everyone's comments. Everyone was kind of pushing for this match params selector instead of a params dot notation in the field selector. So I updated the RFC to reflect that.
I still am not convinced on the need for this, as I wrote in the comments and as we've already discussed. Like, I think there's no reason you need to know about the default value you've set in your supply chain. Any decision you can make, any decision you'd want to make, you should be able to make as long as you can read the params off the workload.
You need to build a model.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Rash.
Yeah, I was going to say that makes the optional parameter no longer optional. It's now required to be specified on the workload. So if it's optional, if I put an optional one that says, what do you want to call me? And the default is Jack, right? Then I can go good. As a workload
don't we
developer.
Have an operator exists, so you could check if the param exists and it matches the value you're looking for, right?
Which value? The default parameter?
So you're saying it necessitates the developer to specify optional, what was
not-
one's optional params.
And if they don't provide it, then where do you get that value? You copy Jack down mentally from where you put Jack as a default parameter. Oh, I got people dropping.
Oh no.
Yeah, it's like, I mean, I don't know. Does this need
I
to
don't
be
know what you
thrown
mean
back
by,
into an?
I mean, I don't know what you mean by that, but
If I've got a supply chain and I say, do you want to run special thing? And you say default false. All right. We go, okay. Oh, it's a default true. We'll say default true. Developer can turn it off by saying no. Then I would like to be able to specify, I won't call this template simply because this has not been set. All right. This is set to false. Sorry, set to yes.
which would have been set in the workload, right? The workload would have set that, right?
And if they didn't set it, the param should default to the default for that parameter for that supply chain it's matching on,
Right, and
which is true.
it still would, but I'm saying you don't need a select based on the default value. All you need to see is,
But you wouldn't
has the-
know that's true.
but you're writing the supply chain, so you know that you defaulted it to true.
So you're copying it down. You're denormalizing your supply chain. You're saying, I know it's going to be true up there, so I'll make it true here.
Saying, I know it's true, so I'm going to run it unless
Yes, yeah.
unless the
Versus it just being
unless the
controlled by a
workloads.
parameter, which
One
you
thing
can
to
then
note is
reconfigure
that
the
the
parameter.
logic of these selectors does not have like quick escaping. So like if you say
It was a
that
terrible
the
example.
key
I needed
exists and
a
the key
name.
needs to be in something,
Hmm.
like both of those conditions will be checked and both of those conditions have to be true simultaneously. So it's not like, oh, if it doesn't exist, then it will fall through. Like that doesn't exist in this world. Unless we implement something custom.
I should have mentioned it, like something that was just a string based, right? What value do you want to pass in here? Oh, this, when this value matches. Just better than true false, but either way.
I think one of the other potential gotchas is like params don't have to be strings.
Right.
So like having dedicated params means like the values could be not a string, as opposed to like fields. It kind of makes the assumption that it is. I think I should double check that.
There's one last item too, if everyone's okay moving on from this one. As a consequence of one of the other RFCs, I think it's the top level field selector one. We brought up the fact that the current template selectors include a workload prefix to the thing that you're matching against. And originally that was there so that we could potentially introduce other things like a params dot. But since we've decided that params aren't going to be matched as part of matchFields, it's more, it's going to be a match params selector, then this workload prefix is kind of unnecessary and we should just remove it.
Especially as it's an alias for owner and it's an alias for deliverable. If it's running in a, if you copy your code over and stick it in a deliverable, you'd have to change that just for no good reason.
Yeah.
The main question in my mind is what's the thing that we're matching against? Like, is it explicitly the workload resource and only ever the workload resource, or is it like a templating context of which the workload is one part?
No, it's
Really
always
strong.
just the workload now.
Yeah.
We originally left it open so that it could be a templating context, but we've now just narrowed it down to only the workload.
All right. Any other comment? Oh, okay. We
Leave
ran out
comments
of
and
time.
vote.
Yeah.
So did we have a discussion about whether any of these go into the, I'm sorry, I'm late and I always do this, but any of these go into the final comment period, or was there some discussion about how we're not there yet?
We need enough votes to move it into the final period, comment period,
Okay.
and none of them have the requisite number of votes.
Okay.
So go ahead and vote anyone who didn't.
Right. Yeah, please vote. Okay, that's great. Thank you so much for your time. See you next week.